The Formula One grid is full of some of the most talented drivers in the world, but the 2022 season creates a whole new challenge for both the teams and drivers with new regulations and a whole new aerodynamic concept for all teams. So what's so different about these cars, and will they suit some drivers better than others? Let's have a look. My name's Andy and this is Behind the Drive. The 2022 cars represent the most radical aerodynamic regulation change in 40 years, and you can see from the grid already that each of these teams have interpreted the rules differently. But fundamentally, they should make following other cars easier, and the cars will have different needs compared with previous years. The ability to follow other cars. From the first test in Barcelona, the drivers seem to be optimistic when it comes to following their competitors. This is one of the key goals of the new regulations. In 2021, the cars lost around 35% of their downforce when driving within 3 car lengths of a driver in front, and then around 50% of their downforce once they were a single car length behind. This was a huge deal, and meant that when overtaking, these drivers would need to brake earlier, thus making a move more difficult into a braking zone. With these new rules, the downforce loss figures were projected to drop considerably, down to just 4% when 3 car lengths behind, and 18% when a single car length behind. This change comes due to the fact that the cars use the ground effect to produce the majority of their downforce, meaning dirty air will be less of an issue. Similarly, the rear wings are designed to push air above the car behind, meaning there won't be as much dirty air in the wake of a leading car. In practice, we don't yet have the data when it comes to whether these anticipated figures have been realised, but what we do know is that the drivers have some more confidence in their ability to follow others. Max Verstappen said it seems like it's a little bit easier to stay behind, adding that it was more predictable than last year. The 2 Williams drivers were also quite confident. Latifi, who's had far more recent experience running behind other cars than Verstappen, commented that it's definitely easier to follow, with Albon saying that he was surprised at how well they could follow other drivers. This is promising to hear, but there are some potential drawbacks. The first of these being that given the downforce loss is reduced, inherently the power of the slipstream has also been reduced as well. This may well mean the cars struggle to catch the car in front on the straights compared to last season. As a counterpoint to this potential slipstreaming issue, it's anticipated that the power of DRS will be improved due to the wider rear wing. So whilst there's a goal to remove DRS in the long run, there might well be a need for it to continue to produce quality racing for this season. So which drivers would benefit from this ability to run closer to the cars in front? Well, in theory, all of these drivers will want to be closer to the driver in front to make overtakes stick. But with cars running closer together, you can expect that the drivers that tend to do well in wheel-to-wheel combat will therefore make more moves stick. The likes of Daniel Ricciardo with his late braking tendencies could well benefit, as well as drivers like Fernando Alonso in wheel-to-wheel combat. Likewise, with cars running closer behind, it may well make defensive driving far more difficult. But before I take a look at the other factors that are changing driving styles in 2022, I want to take a moment to ask you to consider subscribing to Behind the Drive. I've set myself an ambitious goal to get to 50,000 subscribers by the mid-season break, so if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Thanks. Heavier cars. The next key difference for this year compared to the last is the fact that the cars are 43 kilos heavier. Last year, the minimum weight without fuel was 752 kilos, with 2022 cars weighing in at least 795 kilos. It's reported that a number of teams have come in overweight, with Alfa Romeo being the only team that have reportedly been able to hit the minimum weight figure. There's been talk of the minimum weight limit being increased again based on this information, although I believe this would be ridiculous and would be particularly unfair for the teams that have got down to the weight limit or at least closer to it. But the increase in weight means that the cars have been found to be slower through the low-speed corners when compared to last season. This is something that the drivers probably don't like too much as they want a lighter and more nimble car. When you look back a bit further to the mid-2000s, the cars had a minimum weight of 605 kilos, which is almost 200 kilos lighter than the cars of today. The main reason for this tendency for the cars to get heavier over time has been safety improvements. And likewise in 2022, part of the increase in weight comes from improvements to the safety of the chassis. But also, there's a weight increase when it comes to the new 18-inch wheels. Realistically, heavier cars aren't preferable for any of the drivers, with Norris describing his first experience of the 2022 car as sluggish. Schumacher also commented on the weight difference as a key notable difference from his 2021 car. It's likely that teams will find ways to drop the weight through this year to get their cars down to the minimum weight, and this is where it will be difficult to predict which drivers would benefit the most. I suppose the Alfa Romeo drivers could benefit from the fact that their car could be more agile compared to their competitors, at least earlier in the season, but if they don't have much downforce to go along with that, it's unlikely to help them too much. The ground effect. I've already discussed how the changes to the aerodynamic principles mean that the cars will be able to follow each other more easily in 2022, but this isn't the only difference that the ground effect will make. The other change is the fact that the cars need to create a seal with the ground to avoid any air leaking out of the sides of the floor. Back in the 1970s and early 80s, when ground effect was less restricted, the teams would put side skirts on the floor to create this vacuum effect, which would create more downforce. It got to an extreme point with the teams becoming overly sensitive if the ground seal was broken, hence ground effect cars were outlawed at the time. In 2022, there's less of a dependence on this, and the side skirts aren't allowed, but we have already seen that the teams are wanting to get their cars as close to the ground as possible. Some teams, including McLaren, have clearly put some of their development time into the floor in particular, with a focus being on the rear end to take advantage of how much some of these elements could flex. If these elements work, that'll increase the seal, and therefore the downforce, and is likely to be an area of development for all teams over the course of this season. For the drivers, this desire to keep the floor as close to the ground as possible could mean that they want to be slightly less aggressive into the corners. In theory, if a car isn't kept flat, then there's a risk that the downforce could be unexpectedly lost at a rapid rate. This is something that was seen in the 70s, and it was another reason why it was outlawed in the first place. So the drivers today will want to keep it level, and on some bumpy circuits, this could create a new challenge. Now, of course, the 2022 regs have been developed with the past in mind, and lessons will have been learned from when the ground effect had been used in the sport previously. This means it will definitely be safer than the previous era, especially with the skirts being banned. It means that the teams will see less extreme losses of downforce if they end up losing the seal with the circuit, but it's surely a risk that the drivers and the teams will need to consider. Similarly, there may well be some challenges when it comes to wheel-to-wheel racing. If a driver gets hit in the side which damages the floor, this is likely to be terminal damage, and if in wheel-to-wheel contact the seal is broken with the circuit, there could be some hair-raising moments for the drivers this season. Mark Hughes wrote an article for The Race which noted the significant change to Verstappen's driving style, with the Dutch driver being less aggressive into slow-speed corners and tending to be smoother when it came to braking and accelerating through the corners as well. Now, of course, this may well have been an early testing approach, especially with the new car. But given the Red Bull has changed significantly when you consider they've gone from a high-rate concept last season, for example, I think this new driving style could well be something that the rest of the grid is forced to adopt as well. Lando Norris has also been very open about the fact that he's experimenting with new driving styles. He's leaning on his experience of driving new cars in the junior categories to adapt to these new cars. And this self-awareness and willingness to put the time in the simulator to try different driving styles is definitely something that could put him and any other drivers doing the same in a good position when it comes to this new era. Of course, we don't know what the nuances of each of the cars are for this season, and just like previous aerodynamic eras, each of the cars will have their own quirks when it comes to a desired driving style. Already, it seems like Charles Leclerc is able to be more aggressive in the Ferrari, and that implies, at least to my simple brain, that the Ferrari car is slightly more stable. I think it's a reasonable assumption that the more experienced drivers will be able to adapt faster than some of the other drivers. But at the same time, as I mentioned with Norris, having recent experience driving in different cars through the junior categories could well also be an advantage. So really, for me, the drivers that are willing to put more work in the simulator may well come out on top this season if they have a competitive car from their team. Overall, to answer the question of whether the 2022 cars will suit some drivers better than others, and the answer to that question is yes, they certainly will. Drivers that thrive in wheel-to-wheel racing will likely benefit from these new regs, subject to whether they can simultaneously keep their cars planted and level to take advantage of the ground effect. I'm sure all of the drivers will be aware of these changes and the impact that they will have on their desired driving style. And as always, I expect the best drivers to rise to the top once again.